And what I want to do now is get started with a little poll. I'd like to find out a little bit about what everybody who's here today has been experiencing since the pandemic. So I'm going to launch this. All right, so hopefully that's popped up for everybody. And the answers are coming in. Still see answers popping in, so we'll give it another few moments anyway, so that everybody has a chance to respond. Sort of nice when I have multiple questions because I can see the number that have responded to the first question.
Oh,
And then I can see that people are still thinking about the last question. There are still a few who haven't responded to that.
make sure you scroll all the way down so you see all the questions.
Good point. All right, we've got a pretty good response rate at this point. So I'm going to end the poll, but and then I'm going to share the results. So hopefully everybody can see it. So the first one had to do with whether learning has started to rebound or not since the pandemic, and it was kind of split here. Some people feel it started to rebound, but a good half, 50% of those of you who are on this webinar today feel like it hasn't rebounded much or at all, and that kids are still struggling academically. Since the pandemic, in terms of social and emotional, well, this is pretty strong. Almost 90% of everybody on the call today thinks that they've struggled more social emotionally and that they continue to do so. So that's obviously a big concern. Areas of cognitive development. So the number one answer here seems to be focusing and sustaining attention. And the number two here is being able to work at an appropriate pace. And then there's a smattering of other answers, but those are the two most frequent answers. So,
Excuse me, Vanessa said she can't see the results. They should just be right there, right?
yeah, they should. So, what we'll do, so basically on the first question, it was 44% believe that learning has started to rebound, 50% said it hasn't. There was 6% of the group who felt that it really hadn't ever changed very much. For the second one, in terms of social emotional, the most predominant, and this will be in the recording, and also will probably, I might post this somewhere because I just think it's so interesting to see what people's real life experiences have been. So it was 89% felt that kids are really still struggling a lot emotionally. 11% felt that they had started to be able to rebound. And then 12% felt like kids are still struggling with retrieving information. So remembering information. 10% felt that they are struggling with taking feedback and adjusting to it. 42% said that focus and sustaining attention were something they were really seeing as issues in kids. 10% said students' ability to remember a set of instructions and perform them. 10% said understanding and reasoning with verbal information. Nobody thought that kids are struggling more with understanding and reasoning with nonverbal information, and that makes perfect sense. Talk about that. And then the last one was being able to get their work done and working at an appropriate pace. So hopefully that is helpful. And so now, if you would, so out of all of that, or out of maybe there's something else that really has been weighing on your mind that you really think needs to get more attention these days when it comes to students and learning and their well-being. What do you think? Just type in the chat window. What are the biggest concerns? What is your biggest concern right now?
I like Jennifer's comment. She said, so many kids continue to struggle. Some are giving up academically. That's so true.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Jennifer. You're so right. You are so right. Pace is slower if they can't sustain attention. Okay.
Yeah.
Motivation to learn, more of what interests them. These are coming in so fast, it's hard to keep it. Behavior and lack of motivation. Students are more easily frustrated and lack stamina.
I like mental health concerns and not wanting, whoops, I just lost it. It's going to
not wanting to complete the work.
And not knowing how to do it.
Right. Behavior and lack of interest, behavior, social anxiety.
Wow.
Social emotional skills, parents who want collaboration, but there is a lack of listening. Yeah, interesting. Less ability to cope with challenges or changes.
Biggest concern, all the screen time at home. It's very true.
Okay, mental health, lack of resilience and grit, socialization to classrooms, blurting out, perseverance, task initiation.
Right.
Oh boy, our lives are not easy, are they?
No.
And those poor kids. There's lots and lots of struggling. Disaster for special ed kids. Oh my, that was true. There's so much evidence of that. And in fact, one of the things that we'll talk about, especially as we start to look at some of the data that I want to share, is that kids who were in special ed are supposed to be getting services. Kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds, English language students, the very populations that were behind before have fallen further behind. And that doesn't seem to be changing. It was a problem now, and people are talking about it, but the fact of the matter is that those gaps have existed for decades. So today, I'm talking a little bit about academic trends, social and emotional development, the cognitive trends that we see as been observing and being related to and really underlying what the academic and the social emotional data suggests, and then talk about how we can address that. So this is a slide. This comes from the Department of Education, U.S. Department of Education. And this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So it's the assessment that's given every couple of years. And what this is showing is between, so Jennifer raised her hand. So Lou, if you keep an eye on the,
Oh, sure. I didn't see you raise your hand. I'm sorry.
Basically what's happened, following the pandemic is the largest score drop in reading since 1990. And the first ever score drop in mathematics. This is for fourth graders. The eighth graders data is not quite as dismal, but it's also not very good. And well, we don't know in 2024, and the NAEP isn't out yet for the most recent one, but we can look at state data. We do a lot of work with schools in Indiana, so I know we've got at least one person from Indiana here today. And you know what iLearn is doing in the state, I'm sure. So iLearn is the Indiana State Standardized Assessment. And basically what this is showing is in 2019, so the year before the pandemic hit, and then in 2024, the most recent, actually it was for the test that was administered this spring. And what you can see is that this is for English language arts, the percent of kids proficient, and it's down across the board, from third grade through eighth grade. Oh, I see another typo there, but maybe nobody will notice that. But in any event, it's across the board in all grades, and really only about, about 40% of students in Indiana reading proficiently at grade level. Math proficiency, the same story. You see those parallel lines. It is down. And what we know, probably because math is so cumulative, that it just gets worse and worse as you go up in grades. So in eighth grade, only about 30% of students are proficient in math. And then if we look at the combination, of course, we want kids to, pass both. We want them to be able to read. We want them to be able to do math. And the percentage here, again, is down across the board, with really only 25 to 35% or so performing proficiently at grade level, which means that 65 or 70% of kids are not. And so we're a long way from where we really want our students to be. It's not surprising. Of course, we all know that passing two things is a little harder than passing one thing. But it really got me thinking about, why it is so difficult. Is this math phobia? Is it that just instruction isn't as good in one area than another? Is it because teachers tend to be better at teaching reading or math, especially in those early grades when they're responsible for teaching pretty much everything that the kids do? Is it instruction? And so when we know the proficiency has declined, and interventions or the kinds of programs that people have been working on tend to focus on one or the other. And so what I wanted to ask, it's pretty overwhelming for teachers to try to change the way that they do instruction, or to try to do extra instruction in both. And, arguably they're working even harder than they ever had to. I think you'll see that in all of the teacher surveys and things that are out there. But let me just plant a thought. What if there's something that we could do that's so foundational to learning that it will boost both, that'll reading, math, and a whole lot of other things? And if we have clients on the call, then we're going to know what the answer is. But what about the social emotional issues that people are seeing? So this again is U.S. Department of Education, the National Center for Educational Statistics. They have a fairly new school pulse panel where they're tracking information. This shows the most recent data. The vast majority of educators agree that the pandemic has had a big impact on students' social and emotional development. 83, I think in our little informal poll, it was 89%. So that really underscores, there just is no question about that. Everybody's seeing it and everybody's struggling with it. The majority of educators also report that a lack of focus or attention has had a moderate or severe impact on learning at school. This probably was last year. So that actually lines up pretty well with what you all said in terms of the attention being a concern and something you felt had been impacted by the pandemic, and hadn't really started to rebound. That was the number one response to that question. I want to, just also say that this was not a direct measure of attention. It's a measure of teachers' perception of attention. And as we'll see, there are some other learning skills that also have a big impact on learning and that have been impacted. So we're going to come back to that in just a minute. Another statistic that I found particularly interesting here is that third one, where basically the schools that offered high dosage tutoring. So the learning loss from the pandemic was basically assumed by most to be a teaching loss, an instructional loss. Kids didn't have as much instruction, they didn't have as much time with the material, and therefore they are even further behind. And so if that is the assumption, then the logical response is to do something like high dosage tutoring. We're going to give them a lot more instruction, a lot more very intense support, and hope that that's going to catch them up. But what this says is that it's about a 50-50 proposition. There were just about as many that felt it didn't work as did work. And so that's challenging, if it's a case of only works about half of the time, it's sort of a toss-up. And it's very possible. In fact, that's what we're going to really underscore today, that there's something else going on. I don't think any of you will be surprised by any of the information here. There's been so much conversation about the mental health crisis in teenagers, the stats on absenteeism, all those kinds of problems. But as you'll see on the slide, we've been measuring the symptoms. There's been almost no direct measurement of what changes have actually taken place in students' social emotional competencies. And of course, that is a challenge. And it's a challenge because for a number of reasons, probably. But one is that there's not a lot of agreement on what social and emotional competencies are or how to measure them. But there are some models, and one that we think makes a lot of sense, that we see playing out and being very predictive, is a model that actually focuses on executive functions and cognitive regulation. So this is a model from the Wallace Foundation. And I think it's particularly helpful because you've got all of the external factors on the sides, the classroom, the culture, whether or not you've got an SEL program and how well you're doing at implementing it, all the other kinds of external things. But in the middle, what you have are the emotional situation, the social interpersonal skills, the ability to regulate cognitively, that is a key part of social control and emotional competence. So this builds on the Castle model, and it explicitly connects cognitive regulation to self-management and management of others and relationships. And the centerpiece here, which is called cognitive regulation, refers to executive functions. And I know that's a term you all are hearing a lot, and it's a tremendously important term. Executive functions are the mental processes that our students and we rely on to control or modulate our emotional reactions and many other things. And there are actually three executive functions: inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So from a cognitive science, neuroscience point of view, those are the three mental processes that we actually mean. So it's not just about self-regulation. That clearly is part of it, but these are the specific processes and skills that we need. And it turns out that we do know how to measure these skills. One of the things I want to do before I talk about any more about that, though, is to really underscore the fact that executive functions are the same mental processes, whether we're talking about academics or we're talking about social and emotional competence. So if I think about working memory, one of very important executive function, in academics, that is the process that we use to hold on to information and to keep track of where we are in solving a multi-step equation. It's where we hold on to information while we're reading. We're taking in pieces of information and holding them in our mind while we make sense of them, while we comprehend them. And probably one of the reasons that comprehension is so much more difficult than the other parts of reading. But we need our working memory to be able to do that. Working memory is our only conscious processing. And everything we are doing and thinking about at any given moment that's where it's happening. So it's necessary for in academics, and it's also the same process that we use to keep track of what somebody else is saying, what different points of view might look like, comparing them and contrasting them. It's what we do when somebody gives us a set of instructions. So when you ask your students to sit down and open the book to page 33 and take out a piece of blank paper and a pencil, those instructions, in order for them to carry them out, have to be able to be for them to track in working memory. And lots and lots and lots of kids struggle with that. Inhibitory control is pretty much what it sounds like. It's the one that is probably the most similar to self-regulation. It's not leaping to the first answer. It's not blurting things out when kids are reading. Blurting things out is, in the research, suggests that it's less about guessing than it is about a lack of inhibitory control. I'm thinking back to the comments in the chat about not blurting things out in classrooms, which requires, of course, inhibitory control, but it's that same process regardless of the application. And cognitive flexibility is the third. And it means looking at things from different perspectives, understanding how to shift gears and adapt to feedback from the environment. You can imagine how that would look like in a classroom. If you ask someone to stop doing something or to start doing something, their ability to shift gears and adapt and respond to that requires cognitive flexibility. Also very important in academics when we're looking at maybe the different perspectives of characters in a novel that we're reading, or we're looking at different ways to solve a problem in math and understanding that we can approach it in different ways. So not only can we measure executive functions, we can actually assess a whole variety of cognitive skills that are absolutely critical in learning. Most of you that work with us know that we use a cognitive assessment called MindPrint. I'm not going to I'm going to show a little bit of the reporting that comes out of that, but if you want to know more, just we're happy to send you some more information. MindPrint does not measure all of the cognitive capacities that we develop, but it addresses 10 very, very important ones. So different types of reasoning, which is how we understand and problem solve. Different types of memory for long-term. This is how we retain information, memorize it, and are able to retrieve it later. So verbal and visual. Executive functions. The MindPrint test does not directly assess inhibitory control, but inhibitory control is very much related to attention. And so there's an attention test and the two other executive function tests, and then visual and motor speed and processing speed. So the key today is that we have tools that make it doable, if not downright easy, to understand what's going on with students' cognitive skills. And so we can actually look and see if the competencies that embody their ability to have social emotional competence and also the cognitive skills that account for the majority or at least half of the variance in academic outcomes, we can actually understand what's going on now. So this is an example of a Mindprint profile for a student. For those of you who haven't seen one before, basically everything in the big blue box at the top are skills where the student scored in the expected range. So that means typical for either boys or girls their age. For those of you who like statistics, it means within 1 standard deviation of the mean. The little green box on the bottom left shows skills where the students scored in the top 16% of the population, so significantly above average, and skills to support would be those where they scored significantly below average. So this student is very capable learner in many ways, very strong reasoning. Actually, that little star means they scored in the top 5% of the population for abstract or nonverbal reasoning. Really strong flexible thinking. We can see verbal reasoning is high in the expected range, spatial perception, which is the other complex reasoning. So this kid can think, can reason, can problem solve very well, can shift gears and take different approaches, be a wonderful problem solver. Their memory skills are pretty good. Verbal memory is a little stronger than visual memory. But now we start to get into the areas where they're going to be struggling. It turns out that we're going to point the finger here at attention, although we're going to hit some other places pretty soon. But for this particular student, that's an issue. It's going to take them longer to do their work. The attention issues are going to end up resulting probably in gaps in information. They're going to miss pieces of things. And because the processing is slower, that's going to exacerbate that. Because by the time they actually finish processing, and if their attention's wandering off, they're going to miss even more. Also, I just want to point to visual motor speed, that we often joke about this being the video game playing skill. And it is to some degree, but a kid who struggles with visual motor speed may also be struggling with writing. And so if the assignment is something where they have to physically take a pen or a pencil and write something out, that's going to make it even more complex. And it's very likely that they're not going to be able to show what they really can do and really can think about in with their schoolwork, because they're getting stuck with some of these other skills and can't demonstrate how capable they really are. So now I've added some additional information that's going to help as we transition to looking from a single student to looking at a group of students. So what I've done is drawn the green box and that red box. The red box is around the skills where the students scored in the bottom third of the population compared to national norms. So relatively weak compared to their peer group. The student will need extra support beyond what's typically offered in just regular classroom instruction in order to perform proficiently at grade level. The top on the other side, the green box, are skills where the student will be able to form at grade level without extra support beyond what's typically offered in the classroom. This doesn't mean that they would necessarily be as successful as they could be with superior or even more differentiated instruction, but they will be likely to meet expectations. There's no real barrier there. In the middle, skills that are generally strong enough to succeed in a typical classroom with standard kinds of differentiation. A little bit of review and reteaching, and really using best practice instructional strategies. So we can look at a group of students now and sort of the profile. So we can look at a classroom of students and against each of these skills and see what this group looks like altogether. So this is a group of students from a typical school that we worked with prior to the pandemic. We work with a lot of students who are behind academically, struggling to some degree. That was the case here. If this were, exactly reflective of national norms, of course, you would see everything below the bottom line would be red. Everything in the middle between the bottom line and the top line would be yellow, and above the top line would be green. That would mean you had a third in the bottom third, a third in the middle third, and a third in the top third. So that's what it would look like if it was exactly matched national norms. These were students who were lagging in reading and math, but they were not classified as having learning disabilities. They were not really struggling with abstract reasoning, which is the least affected by reading and culture and things like that. They were a little more behind in their verbal reasoning, which makes a lot of sense, and somewhat behind also in their spatial. There were more children in that bottom third percentile struggling with that skill than you would expect if this was a matched a national norm. And that probably makes sense based on their struggles in reading and math. In terms of memory, these students were very typical, very closely matching national norms. And at the top right, I hope you can see that. Yeah, I've got to move my little screens there. You'll see the percentage of students who scored in the bottom third for both, that is needing support, both in visual and verbal memory. And this is something we always calculate and always talk about with the schools that we work with, because it really helps a teacher. So if you've got a classroom, you know that 20% of your students, a fifth of them, are weak in both visual and verbal memory. You know that those students are going to absolutely need things like multi-sensory instruction. They won't remember it if they just see it. They won't remember it if they just hear it. They need to have both. They're probably going to need to have more spaced practice, more retrieval practice, more of mnemonics, more of some of the other kinds of strategies that we know are evidence-based to help them. So especially when there's struggling with both things. If they have stronger visual memory or if they have stronger verbal memory, we can then help them with strategies that help them use that strength to support their weaker skill. This next slide shows executive functions. And what I want you to just look at right now, this is pre-pandemic, is the attention matches up almost perfectly with national norms. A third in the bottom, a third in the middle, a third in the top. So it's a very typical group of students in terms of attention. They are struggling more than a national norm in working memory, and especially with flexible thinking. And when kids struggle with flexible thinking, what that's going to look like in the classroom is that they get stuck easily when their approach to solving a problem doesn't work. When they can't figure something out, they're inclined to give up. So all those comments about they won't stick with it, they just give up, they won't even try it, a lot of that has to do with cognitive flexibility, not attention, not really even motivation in that sense, but cognitive flexibility, because I just can't figure out what to do. And so for a lot of students, this cognitive flexibility, and I won't get too far on my soapbox today because I don't think we have time, but cognitive flexibility to me is one of the most important skills that we can help our students develop. The world is changing so darn fast. In order to adapt, in order to thrive, in order to grow, in order to adjust, we are going to need, our students are going to need especially to be more flexible cognitively. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't think flexibly. It means that it takes an enormous amount of effort. It takes their brains more energy to be able to make those shifts. And so it's, difficult for them, but this is another skill that can be improved. And then we often track this, bottom third for attention and or working memory, because that's usually going to predict overall executive functions and organization. And here you've got 50% of these students that we would predict are going to have difficulty getting their work done.
Okay, Betsy, can I just, there's been a great discussion going on talking about anxiety. Jennifer started it by saying, kids' levels of anxiety are preventing them from being successful in these areas. Sharon was saying, so what causes some of the anxiety? And it said, when anxiety takes place, it's very hard for kids to access their executive functions. And so that makes it even more difficult.
And if their executive functions are weak to begin with, they're going to experience anxiety. So a lot of times the source of the anxiety can be the fact that these skills have not been developed, and therefore it's hard for them. They don't feel confident that they can approach it, and they get anxious about it. And of course, as Jennifer says, that's going to dampen their cognitive processes. It's going to tamp down the frontal lobe functioning and these executive functions, and it's going to make it even worse. So that's a great point.
Great. Good.
So what this does is look at the average for that typical school pre-pandemic, and the average for all of the students that we worked with, hundreds of students that we worked with during the last school year. And so the light blue bar is the typical school. The darker blue bar is the average for the hundreds of students who took that cognitive assessment. Attention is low, but it's always been low. So what we have observed is not an increase in issues with attention. It's still a problem for a lot of students, but it hasn't gotten necessarily worse. We have observed a decrease on average in working memory. And, all of these skills are intertwined, so it gets pretty hard to distinguish them. But the biggest impact, the biggest trend that we have seen has been on memory, the actual ability to remember, retrieve information, to make it stick, and particularly for verbal memory. And if you're reading this graph, these are average percentile rankings. So what I am saying is that of those hundreds and hundreds of students that we tested last year, the average percentile score was the 6th percentile. Let that sink in for a moment. What does that mean? That means that pretty much kids cannot remember what they read and what they hear. It just doesn't stick. A lot of times, teachers will assume that that was attention, that they weren't paying attention, and therefore it didn't get in to even be processed. But what this is suggesting is that the attention isn't all that much different, but their ability to actually have that information stick and then to be able to retrieve it later has been impacted. So what does it look like to work with a student who has weak verbal memory? The teacher presents new material. The students seem to understand it because their reasoning skills are probably okay, but it doesn't stick. And then the next day, later, whenever it happens to be, it's like they never heard it before. So remember that these observations don't hold for every student. They don't hold for every school. That's why it's so important. And we see a lot of variations of this. This is a big trend that we've seen, but it also doesn't mean you're still going to have kids, as the mind print people say, with photographic memory. They remember everything they saw. They remember everything that they hear. There are still kids like that. But what you're going to find is that you have a lot of kids who are really struggling with this. And that's, of course, going to make the teaching process really, really tough. So what I'm going to look at now is data from a single school, so we can talk about a school understand. This is an elementary school that we worked with last year. This is all of their 4th grade students. And you can see that their abstract reasoning is in general good, actually fewer below in the bottom third than you would expect if this was a nationally normed sample. Verbal reasoning, they're struggling with. Spatial perception, actually, they're struggling with quite a bit. We wouldn't necessarily have known that unless we tested them. What does that mean? They're going to struggle with where things are in space relative to each other. Anything that looks like a chart or a graph or geometry or measurement. The kids who are really struggling here, probably their desks are a complete mess and they can't keep track of things, and they don't know, the books keep falling off the desk and things like that. Here's where things start to look really, really different, from national norms. And again, this is memory. I wish I could say that this is an outlier, but as I've just been emphasizing, this is what we've seen the last couple of years over and over again, virtually every school we work with. About twice as many students are struggling to remember stuff, to learn stuff. This is not, of course, a statistically significant sample. I do understand that there is going to be some really remarkable data that's going to be published fairly soon that is very consistent with this, but this particular sample is not. It is our observations of our experience working with a bunch of schools. So it might not be all schools, but there are a whole bunch of schools that have classrooms full of kids who are really struggling to remember information. What about executive functions? What are we going to predict there? Oh boy. Woo! Okay. Most of these fourth grade students needed support across the board for the skills that they need to sustain their attention, to hold information in their minds, to do a multi-step math problem, or when they're reading, they need support to shift gears and take feedback and adjust to the environment. These kids are capable of reasoning pretty much like any other group of kids, but they're really going to struggle academically and behaviorally. Remember, those two go together. These cognitive skills support both because of their weaker memory and their weaker executive functions. So, next question is, can we do anything about this? Can we actually strengthen and remediate these skills? And the answer is that we can. It's not going to happen with high dosage tutoring or more of the same kind of instruction that we've been giving, but it can be developed with comprehensive cognitive training in a pretty short period of time. So going back to our pre-pandemic sample school, here you can see the impact of cognitive training. These students use Brainware Safari 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes for 12 weeks. So in that 3-month time frame, their attention went from the 22nd percentile on average to in the middle of the expected range to the 35th. Working memory went all the way up to the 54th percentile. Flexible thinking, right into the middle of the expected range. Visual memory is very strong now for these kids. Remember, this is pre-pandemic, so their verbal memory was still pretty good. But you look across the board, and these kids now are in the middle of the expected range or higher for all of these skills. So you're going to have a group of students who is much easier to teach, who is getting it much more quickly, who's remembering it better, and who are probably behaving a lot better as well. Now, what about for our post-pandemic students? So this is last year. So this looks at pre and post test, and in this case, some of the schools used it a little bit longer. So on average, this is like 3 to 5 times a week for 5 months in like 30-minute sessions. And this is the kind of impact it had. So you can see the improvement across the board, that improvement in verbal memory, while they still after this period of time did not get up to the middle of the expected range, but this is that's a significant improvement, significant impact. Overall 13 percentile points on average, and 0.37 standard deviations, which is a lot of movement on average across all of these skills. Let's look at two. Okay. Guess I printed that twice. Next question is probably, okay, and did that help them academically? Well, the I-Learned, which is the data that we looked at before, which is the state standardized test in Indiana. These students took it. They had taken it for the first time when they were third graders. That's actually why this school district implemented at the fourth grade rather than the third grade, because they wanted to be able to compare the previous year, the first year these kids took I-Learned to after they had done cognitive training. So what you're looking here, the left two bars on this chart are the state data, the school district on the right-hand side. Significantly more students are performing at or above proficiency in reading, a lot fewer students performing below proficiency. And remember that what's happening here is that once you've strengthened your cognitive skills, you still have to develop the skills in reading and math and the knowledge content and all that kind of thing to do well on an I-Learn. So you're going to see usually the biggest impact on academics comes a while later. This one was right on top of, they had just barely finished their cognitive training. So we expect there to be, and we have seen actually in other schools in the district, the different grades, seen a cumulative impact over the years on academic performance. Basically, it's the same in math. Interestingly, I learned there were these at the state level, fewer students are performing at or above proficiency, but we're getting a much better result in terms of academics, and expect more. We've done a little bit of measuring of some things that you would expect to be impacted by stronger cognitive skills, stronger executive functions that start to get into this whole area of social and emotional competence and behavior. What these principles was, this is fairly anecdotal at this point, but we have in some other schools collected this kind of information, but many fewer referrals to the principal's office. And what does that mean? Lou, as a principal, if you have less kids coming into your office to because they've gotten into trouble, what does that let you do?
It gives me more time.
Gives you more time to work with teachers, to work on instruction, all that stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Greater self-confidence, being able to bounce back from frustration, less anxiety. Jennifer, that one's for you. Willingness to take on more challenging work. So if we remember that these cognitive processes, executive functions especially, affect learning and behavior, then that's something that we can do. We can actually help them develop those skills so that they can support both, so that they can be more effective, they can be more accomplished academically, and they can manage their behavior better. They go hand in hand too. When kids know that they can do something, when they feel confident that they can take on their learning, that they can manage their learning, that's tremendously empowering. And the anxiety is going to go down. The anxiety is going to go down for the students and for the teachers. It's a lot easier to teach a class that is getting it a little bit better, that's not quite so hard. When you look at those memory skills, and if you think about the typical thing you would think about as a teacher, I have to teach it again. I have to teach it again and again and again. I have to teach it, instead of 12 times, I have to now teach it 15 or 17 times. that is exhausting. That whole idea is just, it makes me anxious, frankly, just thinking about it. And I'm not physically in that kind of classroom anymore, although I do teach still, but um,
And they don't have the
so,
time to really even do that. You know, the teachers are packed anyway, and to try and expand it even more. Mhm.
so just here's what I hope you'll take away today. Just recap some of what we've been talking about. Um, the kinds of changes that we are seeing following the pandemic in our students are very likely the root cause of the academic and behavior issues that we're also seeing. The biggest impact seems to be actually on the ability to learn and retrieve information. So with long-term memory, both verbal and visual, but especially verbal memory. And then just as, but you know, given all those generalizations and given those trends, just as students' experiences varied during the pandemic, just as every child learns differently and has developed differently, their cognitive development was affected differently. So schools need to understand the cognitive strengths and weaknesses of their students more than ever. And to know that these declines or even lower skills, I mean, it doesn't matter that it happened because of the pandemic. It really doesn't matter why it happened when it comes to strengthening cognitive skills. Wherever you start, skills can be strengthened to a far greater degree, as you've seen, than I think most people understand. So just a couple of more QR codes and some more opportunities. We're going to, if you scan the first one, you'll be entered into a drawing for a signed copy of a book that my colleague and I, Roger Stark, published recently called Your Child Learns Differently, Now What? There's a free ebook on cognitive skills and the science of learning that you can download just by scanning that second QR code. And if you're a school and would like to schedule a time for a demo discussion about how this, what this would look like in your school environment and how it might apply, feel free to scan that third one, and you'll can pick a time that works for you or for you and your team. So I'm going to stop talking for a little bit, and I hope there's some great questions.
Oh my goodness, there's been such a great conversation going on and questions, and it's really exciting to see all the involvement. One of the questions that has been coming up is talking about flexible thinking. You know, how do students develop flexible thinking? One asked, well, exactly what is flexible thinking? I like Jennifer's, I just have to throw this in here. It says, many adults don't have flexible cognitive flexibility. Think about a fixed mindset. Kids
Yes.
learn early on from their parents. I thought that was, you nailed it there. So you want to talk a little bit about flexible thinking, cognitive flexible?
Yeah. So flexible thinking is your ability to see things from different perspectives. So when one of the examples I often give is, you know, you've probably, and we probably all had this experience. You have two friends who come to you and they tell you about the same experience, and it sounds like it was two completely different events. And you're going, how can that be? It's because people experience things differently, and people's realities are different. And some people have a much harder job, much harder time shifting and looking at something differently. So here's an example you might find in a classroom. Lou and I talk about this one all the time. So you've got a student in a classroom, he puts his pencil down on the desk, he turns to talk to a friend, he turns back and the pencil's not there. What happened? Another kid stole it, right? Immediate answer. Well, maybe, but maybe not. So there are so many opportunities in real life to help kids come up with alternative explanations for things, to help them think, well, maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it just fell off onto the floor. Maybe your friend took it to sharpen it for you as a favor. Maybe that cute little girl you've been wanting to hook up with wrote her phone number down for you. Maybe, okay, so that exercise of maybe thinking, possibly thinking different explanations, that's really what cognitive flexibility is all about. You know, we all experience this in our lives as well. You know, how many things have changed since you started teaching?
Mm.
You know, when you started teaching, I didn't have a computer. I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have, like, we had an overhead and we had ditto machines. Everybody remember those, right? So
Right.
we've had to adjust a lot, and we've had to adjust our instruction. That takes cognitive flexibility. And our world today demands it more than ever. It's one of the key things that actually that employers are looking for in employees today. And there are a lot of kids. So when you see a kid or another adult, you know, Jennifer's totally right about that as well. It's someone who seems rigid, you know, someone who just they might even seem stubborn, right? Because you're explaining something, oh, it's really not that way. Well, of course it is. Or they'll agree with you, they'll nod their head, and then they'll keep behaving the same way.
Mhm. Mhm.
So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I've seen many of our students. I'm really surprised that they see in black and white. It's either yes or no, or they have a specific answer. And by doing these little drills and forcing them to, well, what else could be? What could be another reason? What could be another reason? Really makes the kids, think a little bit outside the box. There was another great discussion going on about homeschooling and the pandemic. Has there been any kind of research done, or do you know how kids compare differently? Do they see the same struggles as we're
No,
seeing in our
I
schools?
I don't really know. We do work with a lot of homeschooling families, some of whom decided to homeschool during the pandemic because their
We're not,
kids were really
yeah.
just did not do well trying to sit in front of a screen. I don't know that we work with a lot of homeschooling families, and again, every child we work with gets a Mindprint assessment. We know how they learn. We can share. In fact, it's great working with homeschooling families because mom is teacher, right? So you don't have to, once you understand how your child learns, you don't have to go and persuade a teacher to adopt the appropriate strategies for your child. You just do them, right?
Right.
So it is.
Hmm. I think that's a big factor, that our children need to understand what kind of learner they are, what their strengths are. If you ask any child, I bet you if you go into the classroom right now and say, okay, how do you learn? They won't be able to tell you the answer unless you've gone through something like this and you spend time talking about their individual strengths and how to use them. Mm-hmm.
I often talk about, and parents um, share this with me all the time, which is that because we work with a lot of kids who do struggle, and what their parents say is that they've heard nothing but what their child can't do, what their student can't do.
Right.
And I know that is not a condemnation of teachers. I know how hard teachers try and how much they want to help them, but sometimes the system can get in the way and make things a little bit more challenging. And so what we always like to start with those strengths, because when kids, the fact that you can't remember what somebody said yesterday, so I can keep telling you that thing over and over again and hoping you remember, or I can help you understand that your strength is remembering it visually. And we can draw a picture, a chart, a graph, a diagram, some kind of schematic. We can build a model. We can do a whole bunch of different things that are going to make it way easier for you as a student to remember that. Why wouldn't we do that? So when kids do that, they strengthen some of their other skills. They have this sort of double whammy of having more confidence because they can do it, and because they also understand what those strengths are, and value the fact that everybody does learn differently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's another question said, how can you implement cognitive training at home? Can you share some examples and strategies to use at home? The one that popped into my mind, Betsy, is the one we're talking about when we have three numbers to remember, three large numbers. And when you're in the car driving with your kids, just give them, 37, 92, 12. What were the three numbers? And to practice those numbers, and see if they can give them back to you to increase that working memory. And then add another fourth number and so forth. Okay, that was one of the ideas.
Yeah, so there, I think we've got a lot of things on our website too, and
Yes.
we'll post some of those that people can access. What we know about really effective cognitive training, if you want to have the kind of impact that we've shown in the research that we've done, it means a comprehensive integrative cognitive training program that's very constructed the way that the brain works. So you can do isolated activities, but unless the way that this is integrated, it would be it can be done, but you would have to go and be trained extensively, and it would take hours and hours and hours of learning how to do it. It's certainly possible to do it, but it is very labor intensive, and it can be very expensive without a tool to support it.
I'd start with those books you just showed. Your book that you and Roger wrote is an excellent resource. And then just start with the free download to get the information. There's some great examples talking about experiences that we've had out in the field. Some great stories that you can share, and a lot of ideas that can help you and your students.
Yeah, and the cognitive skills book has all kinds of takes on cognitive skills, the impact of poverty, I think there's even some second language stuff in there. There's just a lot of really, this is a field we've been writing about, thinking about for a long time. So we're at the end of if I missed questions, we will try to catch them up. And I also have to say, I hope that I actually took a look at all the questions that people submitted when they registered. It is by far the most extensive and best set of questions that I have ever seen from one of our webinars. So
that's great.
Yeah. So I will, here it is. Here's
wow.
All those questions. I got pages of questions. So anyway.
You understand the need. Yeah, they understand the interest and the need to have more discussions on this.
Yeah, so stay tuned. We do, we post a lot on our Brain More Learning page on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Instagram. We're pretty much everywhere. So there's a lot of material. There's a lot of information on our website as well. We have a lot of recorded webinars, white papers, just lots of, content that people can hopefully find helpful. So thank you all for coming today. We really, really appreciate it. And I don't know what my next one is going to be, but it'll be coming up pretty soon. So
yeah. We'll be in contact with all of you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks for joining. Okay. Bye-bye. All right.
And